My husband and I got married 12 years ago and have been a couple for almost 16 years. We are both 34 years old. We have 2 lovely children, a 10-year-old son and a 9-year-old daughter. My husband is an amazing person. He takes care of our family well, even though we both have jobs. He is also a fantastic father. My parents adore my husband even more than they do my brother or me. In fact, my female friends often tell me how fortunate I am to have committed to a long-term relationship with him. Despite everything I mentioned earlier, I made a big mistake. When I began working evening shifts to complement my husband's schedule, I met another man at work. It happened during a fire drill. Our assigned rally points were next to each other, so he left his group to introduce himself when he saw me. He works in the same building but has a different office on a different floor. He's taller than my husband and spends a lot more time in the gym. He has a perfectly chiseled chin, looks as handsome as a model, and exudes confidence. The other man started giving me a lot of attention. He would constantly text me, sending pictures of his well-toned abs and even some explicit photos, pressuring me to do the same. I was fully aware that this was all wrong, but I got caught up in the butterflies in my stomach feeling. It felt like I was back in high school, and I found myself enjoying the thrill of teasing him. Strangely, even though I knew that the flirting was risky and could be disastrous for my marriage if my husband found out, that danger somehow added to the excitement and thrill of it all. I reached a point where I convinced myself that having my husband as the primary caregiver at home wasn't satisfying enough for me. I started believing that my husband wasn't giving me the attention I needed. I feel ashamed to admit it, but I got to a stage where I constantly checked my phone, eagerly waiting for his next text. After 2 months of getting to know each other, he invited me for lunch on a Friday. We went in his car, and after going through the drive-thru, we decided to have our lunch in his car. As we spent time together, one thing led to another, and we started kissing, which eventually escalated to being intimate in his car. After being intimate with him in the back seat of his car, I felt extremely cheap. It was as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes, and I saw the disgusting nature of my actions. To make matters worse, we didn't use any protection. The fog of the affair had cleared, and I was hit with the harsh reality that I had betrayed my husband. It was the most awful experience of my life. Everything had seemed exciting until we crossed that line, and suddenly it all felt horribly wrong. Overwhelming guilt and shame took hold of me. I realized that this was not what I truly wanted and that I was making an enormous mistake. I returned home, took a shower, but no amount of water could wash away the shame I felt. When I entered the bedroom, my husband was already fast asleep. I stood there silently, watching him sleep, tears streaming down my cheeks. Regret consumed me for what I had done. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my husband entertaining our children. They were gathered in front of the TV, and my husband was putting on a playful show for them, pretending to engage in an imaginary sword fight with an invisible foe. The kids were all smiles, laughing and giggling. He seemed to be telling them a captivating story or something of that sort. I stood there for a few minutes, silently observing this heartwarming scene. So, I began taking steps to make amends. I had no intention of confessing to my husband, but I was determined to become the best version of myself for him. We started being intimate every day, and when that wasn't possible, I ensured he would at least receive a special moment before or after every intimate session. I began cooking more meals at home and rekindled our date nights because my parents were more than willing to babysit with a simple phone call. I can honestly say that our relationship was better than ever. A few days later, the other man invited me to lunch, but I turned him down. He continued to send me text messages, but I refused to respond. I deleted all the inappropriate pictures I had sent him, hoping he would understand my silence and stop reaching out to me. However, he didn't stop there. He decided to confront me in person at work, asking why I hadn't responded to his messages and expressing a desire to repair our encounter. I firmly told him no, emphasizing that it was a mistake and that he should leave me alone. He persisted, and I finally told him that I love my husband and that he couldn't compare to my husband in any way. This offended him, and he walked away, leaving me hoping that this would be the end of it. Later that day, I returned home, greeted my husband with a kiss, engaged in some casual conversation, and then went to take a shower before our planned trip to the movies. When I emerged from the shower, I could immediately sense that something was terribly wrong. My husband was staring at his phone, tears streaming down his face. I asked him what was the matter, and he handed me his phone. To my horror, the other man had sent him our entire message conversation along with the explicit pictures I had sent, along with details about our physical affair in his car. I was left stunned, unsure of how to respond. My husband asked me if it was true, and I decided to come clean about everything. He inquired if I had ever intended to confess, and I admitted that I would have taken the secret to my grave if it weren't for the revelation. I tried to explain that it was all a terrible mistake and that I regretted it more than anything in the world. I pleaded with him not to leave, promising to do whatever it took to make amends. Well, he left for 2 days, during which he didn't answer my calls or texts. I even tried to reach him at his workplace, but I was informed that he had taken a few days off. When he finally returned home, he spent some time with the kids and then he began packing a bag for himself. He told me that our relationship was over. He explained that if I believed I could do anything without facing consequences, he had the same right to do as he pleased, regardless of the consequences. Then, he poured out his feelings to me. He talked about all the sacrifices he had made for our relationship and our marriage. He revealed that he never finished school because our son arrived, and we needed money more than he needed to complete his education. He had distanced himself from friends because I wasn't comfortable with them. He consistently put my needs and desires above his own. He even spent more time with the kids than I did, and while he loved them dearly, he rarely had time for himself. In contrast, I often went out with friends after work. Despite all this, despite everything he did for me, I had the audacity to cheat on him. He had loved me unconditionally, even with all my flaws and issues, and I had entertained an affair. He couldn't see how he could spend his life with someone who had no respect for him. He believed that all the attention I had recently given him was driven by guilt and not genuine care. He felt it was time for him to focus on himself for once, and so he moved out. We handle our finances separately. My husband earns almost 3 times what I do. We maintain several accounts for different purposes. We have a joint account for shared expenses like bills and groceries, another account is for children's needs, and there's one more for emergencies and savings. Last week, he received his salary and promptly deposited the usual amounts into our joint accounts. This gave me a sense of relief, as it made me believe he's not completely disengaged from the situation I've created. We're supposed to meet tomorrow to discuss where we stand and what the future holds for us. I'm determined to convey to him that I've made a terrible mistake and that I'm willing to do whatever he asks of me to make amends. I'm prepared to take on more responsibilities at home, reduce the time I spend with friends, and focus more on our children. If he wants to go back and finish his education, I'll fully support that decision. I'm so desperate to make things right that I'm even willing to allow him to pursue other relationships with other women if that's what he desires. I'm really struggling with how to approach this conversation with my husband without coming across as manipulative. Throughout all of this, he hasn't mentioned divorce, and to the best of my knowledge, he hasn't confided in anyone about our situation. I did share my dilemma with my mother and asked for her advice, and she was very disappointed in me. However, I also requested that she keep it confidential, and as far as I know, she hasn't told anyone else. The fact that he hasn't brought up divorce does give me a glimmer of hope, but I can't help but feel anxious about what tomorrow's discussion might entail. Perhaps he'll ask me for a divorce. Update. These past few days have been a living nightmare. The distance between us has widened more than I ever imagined, and I can sense the weight of my husband's avoidance bearing down on our once loving marriage. Little did I know that this tumultuous roller coaster would take its most heart-wrenching turn tonight. As I mentioned earlier, my husband called me and requested that I leave our kids with my parents. Then, he asked me to meet him a few hours later at a charming little restaurant we used to visit in our younger days, the same place where he took me on our first date. At first, I thought of it as a positive sign that he wanted to meet at a familiar place, somewhere with sentimental history for us. However, as the hours passed, I began to doubt this and saw it more as a kind of poetic justice. It seemed like the place where our relationship began would also be the place where he intended to end it. It felt like a cycle coming full circle, turning a positive into a negative, all in the blink of an eye. Even though I had seen him almost daily over the past 6 weeks, he had been avoiding me, and I hadn't had a proper look at him. I noticed that he had lost weight, got a new haircut, and was dressed very nicely, almost as if it were a special occasion. It seemed like he was ready to move on from our troubled relationship. As we entered the dimly lit restaurant, I couldn't help but notice the tension in the air, like a storm was brewing beneath the surface. I wanted to reach out and hug him, but he stopped me short. We sat at a corner table, isolated from the few other diners, giving us an uncomfortable sense of privacy. The awkward silence persisted as we perused the menus, our eyes never quite meeting. I had butterflies in my stomach, the kind that always seemed to accompany moments of confrontation. Finally, he broke the silence with a heavy sigh. "Listen," he began, his voice shaky and filled with emotion, "there's something I need to talk to you about." My heart raced as I looked into his eyes. They were filled with pain, anger, and betrayal. I knew what was coming, but I had hoped against hope that we could somehow find a way to mend our broken bond. He continued, "I can't ignore what happened between us, what you did with your coworker. It shattered me, shattered us, and I've tried to understand, but I can't. I've been through sleepless nights, agonizing over every detail, and I've realized that I can't go on like this." His words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. I reached out to touch his hand, but he pulled away. "I've decided," he continued, his voice breaking, "that we need to get a divorce." My world crumbled in that moment. The pain in his eyes mirrored the pain in my heart, but I couldn't accept it, not without a fight. "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my cheeks. "We can't give up. We can work through this, for the sake of our kids. Please, let's try," I begged, but he shook his head, his resolve unwavering. "I thought long and hard about this, and I can't live with the constant reminder of what you did. It's over." I couldn't hold back the sobs any longer. It felt like my world was collapsing around me, and I was powerless to stop it. My emotions swirled in a maelstrom of guilt, regret, and heartbreak. Despite the overwhelming sorrow, a spark of defiance ignited within me. I wiped away my tears and looked directly into his eyes. "If this is what you want, if you're determined to end this, then fine. But know that I won't make it easy for you. I wouldn't give up our family without a fight, and I won't sign those divorce papers without a fight." He nodded, his face still etched with pain. "I expected nothing less from you." As we sat there, our future hanging in the balance, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sorrow for what was slipping away. Our love story had taken a tragic turn, and the road ahead would be filled with heartache, tears, and uncertainty. But I knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't go down without a fight for the love we once shared and the life we had built together. The days that followed were an agonizing blur of paperwork, lawyers, meetings, and judgmental stares from family and friends. The revelation of my affair had spread like wildfire, fueled by my husband's desire for vindication. He had exposed the affair to everyone we knew, and the shame was unbearable. The constant judgment and whispers behind my back wore me down, pushing me closer to the edge. My family, who had always been my staunchest supporters, were disappointed and heartbroken by my actions. They, too, sided with my husband, urging me to grant him the divorce he sought. The pressure from all sides was unbearable, and I found myself cornered, pushed into making decisions I wasn't ready for. During the divorce proceedings, I fought hard for primary custody of our children. I believed that despite my mistakes, I could still be a good mother to them. I argued that my husband's demanding work schedule wouldn't allow him to provide the stability and care they needed. I also demanded child support, given his significantly higher income, and alimony to maintain the lifestyle to which I had grown accustomed. However, the court's decision was harsh. They acknowledged that my husband had spent more time with the children due to my work commitments and granted both of us shared custody. It was a bittersweet victory. On the bright side, I would still be a part of my children's lives, but it also meant that I wouldn't have the sole influence over them that I had hoped for. To add to my disappointment, the court denied my request for child support, arguing that shared custody meant shared financial responsibility. My plea for alimony was also denied. It seemed that the universe was conspiring against me, and I was left to face the consequences of my actions alone. As the divorce proceedings concluded, I found myself in a dark and desolate place. My husband had moved out, and the only interactions we had were related to the children. He refused to engage with me on any other subject, and it was painfully clear that our once loving relationship was now beyond repair. I tried desperately to reach out, to apologize for the pain I had caused and to express my regret, but my attempts fell on deaf ears. It became painfully evident that he had moved on from me emotionally. The isolation and loneliness I felt were crushing, and I realized that I had lost not only my husband but also the life I had known and the family I had cherished. In the end, the divorce had left me broken, stripped of the support and security I had once taken for granted. All that remained was the hope that, in time, I might find a way to rebuild my life and regain the trust of those I had hurt the most, my children. If you loved this story and crave more tales of love, betrayal, and healing, don't forget to subscribe for more from Cheating Stories.